when it comes to human geography, you can go into what's known as critical geographies, and that's different ways of looking at space and power. So even when we talk about gentrification, when we talk about displacement, when we talk about environmental racism, like why are certain things built in certain neighborhoods, and then why are cancer rates so high? You start to look critically at the foundation. Again, like it's very much tied to race in a society that doesn't even want to really truly be honest about its own history around race. It's like you can't even get to the foundation of really what informs all these type of ideas and concepts.
It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free.
Hello, friends and family. It's another episode of Freedom Friday. It is Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you're freer after this hour with Sharif El-Mekki, Ish, and me. Let's jump in, fellas. It's another Friday episode where we get to teach, we get to learn, we get to share a table where we can exchange some information, become smarter people at the end of it. Today's topic actually is going to make me a smarter person because I have two educators, and I love being able to have my own questions answered just selfishly about things that I don't know about. So I think right before we got started today, I framed out for you that last night I had teacher conferences, and one of the classes that I had to follow up with for one of my kids was human geography. Now, I thought that was a made-up class, and I didn't think that was a real thing. So when my son told me he was taking human geography, I thought it was some weird elective, because at his school, they do have lots of electives, things like life skills. All three of my kids have taken a life skills classes. And I'm like, well, what's life skills? What's in that class? Apparently that class touches on everything from banking to home ec. Right.
Skills
in one class. Right. Yeah. So, but this human geography, what is that really a class? And then I just said that to you, and you were like, no, that's a real thing.
Excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah. You got it. Well, why? Why, Sheree? Tell me what human geography actually is for people who don't know, because I was one of them and I'm still mostly one of them.
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, one, it's first of all, I think this just being able to nerd out on courses and classes and what students, I think the goal was always for me, like, how can kids be smarter by the end of the day, month, year, their time with us, right? And so human geography were one of those classes. I always thought about like writing classes, if you can write really well, obviously the basics of reading and math, but, thinking, but also understanding the earth, the world, the, human beings. Anytime we could introduce those kind of things. So human geography, AP course that our sophomores used to take. And it was the opportunity to really study human beings and how human being behavior kind of changes and shifts geography, right? And so think about like migration, think about, populations and how they might shift. And in that shifting, what impact does it have on geography, right? Like, what do they do to make it more conducive for human beings? But also, what harms do they do, right? So it could be anything from, hostile expansion, from east to west, as you're, destroying indigenous people and populations. But also, why would they say kill all the buffalo? Right. And you kill every buffalo you kill is a dead Indian. Right. Like these are things that people could really understand, or students can kind of understand. But then also, like, why is there a boundary there? How does, a subcontinent like India become India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh? Right. Like how do all of these Kashmir, like how do all of these things happen? Why do they happen? And what's the impact that it has on the people and the land? So it's just one of those things just to kind of give this global perspective. I was always, as a child that grew up with this international perspective, I've always been just a little, nervous about not being able to pass that forward in some, even if it's not the traveling part, at least the thinking and analysis part. So human geography was one of those kind of conduits to be able to do that.
I feel like that's deep and very interesting, because I do wonder, we talk about like Texas, Mexico, California, where the lines came from, how there was lines. And today, we talk about people in terms of them being illegal aliens, right? Like,
just analyze that, right?
Yeah. Like that's a deep concept. illegal alien. As a human being, first of all, you're illegal and you're an alien. Why? Because there's this border. Why? Because somebody set a border. Why did they set a border? How did they get the border? How did they come to own, that particular thing? And you go to Southern California right now, it still has retained a lot of its Mexico-ness, if for lack of a better word, right? Mm-hmm. So is Texas. And people talk about it now in war terms. Like we have an invasion and our borders are under attack and they're so porous. And really, it's thousands of people walking many miles for a reason. I don't know all the reasons, to be very honest with you. Apparently, there's like whole groups of people in South America who are walking many miles, and I'm sure all their reasons aren't the same. There are things happening in their countries. Now, would human geography help me understand that?
It would at least get you to discuss it. I mean, some of this is like who your teacher is, so keep that in mind. But yes, it opens up the avenues. Like, so if I was teaching that course, I'd also introduce this idea of like, okay, after what happened, if you trace back a lot of this migration, it's like this T-shirt I saw not too long ago. It's like, don't hate immigrants, hate the people that caused them to be, or don't hate refugees, hate the people who caused them to be refugees, right? Like that kind of thing. So it's being able to peel back. It's looking at right now, they said there's a phenomena where because Europe is so displaying such a hostile form of xenophobia and closing, even though they are continuing to rape the continent of Africa, they're telling the people, don't follow these resources up to Europe. And so we have Africans now who are actually flying to South America and Central America to come to the U.S. through that border because Europe is being closed off to them. And, we've seen all the deaths in the drownings and things like that, people trying to, get to Europe. So now they're like, hey, we can save money, fly to South and Central America, and then try to go that way. And we know if we get to Texas, they'll bus us to Chicago or Philly or New York or whatever they do down in Texas to get rid of people who are striving to really live the American dream, right? That's what it's supposed to be. Find a better opportunity, find better, circumstances. So.
And that's real deep that you mentioned that, because even when you talk about who's an acceptable refugee and who isn't, I think about how much love was put out towards you and relocating them to the United States and providing space for them. Yet when we talk about the conversation of any other group like Haitians, right, for example, Americans are talking about sending them back to Haiti after the fact, right, after even living here for over a decade or almost a decade. So I think it really speaks to even the conception of what's acceptable. And it's tied, unfortunately, to whiteness, I would argue. And that what's unacceptable are Black and brown people trying to come into America. And there's a long intellectual genealogy in this society that speaks to the fact that they don't want to mongrelize the blood, right? We even have Donald Trump, the leading candidate for president right now, talking about poisoning the blood, right? And they're talking about specifically non-white folks coming into America. So if there was a bunch of folks on our border from, say, that look like British or Ukrainian, I doubt there would be such a cry for closing the border. I bet you there wouldn't be such a cry to keep these people out because they are degenerates and they're bringing the worst into this country. But that becomes the narrative, even to the point right now that our government is willing to shut down because they're not willing to have a real conversation about what needs to be done to really help and really address this issue for real. Because it is an existential issue that has a lot of baggage associated with it, especially when you see the countries that folks are coming from, because they're not really coming from Mexico anymore. They're coming from places like Honduras. They're coming from places like Venezuela, right? And we can point directly to U.S. policy over the last 2 decades in those places, from the coup in Honduras in the early 2000s, Venezuela's literal cutoff from mainstream economy in the world. Since
Even
Hugo
before
Chavez,
even before then. Look, I remember as a kid, one of the books I had on repeat because it was at my aunt's house. It was about the CIA intervention in Central America, and it just talked about all the brutality. And I was like, I wish I remembered the name of this book, because as a young kid, it was one of my books. I would visit her in the summer, and each time I would read it. I was a little older, a little bit more sophisticated, so I could, you know, it was like Malcolm X autobiography. Every time I read it, it was, you know, pull something else from it. But I was just like, man, like this is, you know, just the instability that America has caused around the world. You know, so this is another, you know, and I think you can talk about these in most classes in some level, but this one I think is very specifically about people, patterns, land, that whole, what is it called? The Malthus concept, you know, Malthusian, right? Like, oh, human beings are going to keep growing and there's not going to be enough food. So if you believe that, what do you do to not have the population grow? Right? If that's your core belief that there's there's not abundance, there's a deficit in resources. Not let's take care of the resources, but like let's make sure we're limiting the human growth population. If you believe that firmly and you have power, at what distance would you go if you have no moral compass to reject it? You know?
There's so much to me that I wish I knew more about, but there's levels of this because as I'm listening to y'all talk, it seems like it goes into multiple different topics and multiple different layers. So it's real when we think about global supremacy, it's real. But, you know, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking to myself,
why apologize in my to your lifetime kid if you were clowning them for taking that class, first of all.
I was. I have to admit it. I was. But, you know, so like one question is in my lifetime, every time we've seen visuals of refugees on boats, it's always been people of color. I can't really think in my mind of a white refugee situation in my life. You know, I go back multiple decades in my life. And in all those decades, there have been Cuban refugees, Haitian refugees. I've seen boats overturned. While we were spending money in one place, there were people of color drowning in Greece in a boat that overturned, right? And it always seems like it's people trying to get away from something to a place that has more resources. And you all just said something like that. You just said, we got to ask ourselves the question of why are they on those boats? How that's all coming to be. But then one of you said the thing about Ukraine. That was probably one of the first and only really white refugee situations that I saw. I just pulled it up because I wanted to pull up this quote because I think it says a lot about everything we're talking about. This is from an article in The Guardian a couple years ago. While on air, CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie Diaga, again, I don't know how to say his name, stated last week that Ukraine isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen a conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose my words carefully, city, one where you wouldn't expect that and hope that it's not going to happen. And then there's a thing where he says, these people look like us. Right, they're more like European. So somehow the name of this article, or one of the articles on this, is, are Ukrainians more worthy of sympathy than Afghans and Iraqis? Many seem to think so, right? And all the questions that opens up for me is, why are there so many people of color that are in that position of trying to have to jump a gate to get into a place? Why are they being so heavily regulated to get into those places? Why do those places, they're like gardens, are owned by gardeners that all look alike, right? Why do all the world's resource bases that people want to get more resources, they're all, you know, well, I don't know how to say it, but they're not people of color, right? Like places of color.
But this is why it's so important. You know, when Malcolm says history most benefits us, it's the discipline that most benefits us. It's this idea that being able to connect the dots. And so, as you said, like, you know, people of color often are like what that means, but you can't talk about migrants, immigration, refugees, you know, usually without talking about colonialism, imperialism, you know, and just having students and people, period, analyzing, like, if you're from a country that is wealthy in resources but poor in infrastructure, you know, poor in government, like you gotta investigate like how that happens. Like, you know, they talk about like the Congo, you can drop a seed and it'll grow. So then why are there, you know, and you're talking about like just the heart of Africa, the Congo, with all these minerals and resources and, you know, just all these things that, you know, should make it a real life Wakanda, that kind of thing. But it's the
Mm-hmm.
exact opposite, right? And all of these places where people are fleeing, but resources are also fleeing from that same country. They got countries with resources who send it out to Europe to be processed, manufactured, and then sold back to the country that it originated from. Right. And then when students start realizing, like, oh, when people tried to nationalize their cocoa, their oil, their other things, what happens to them? Like, you can almost predict if you nationalize in this type of country, a country of color, and removing folks from, whether it's be Cuba and Venezuela, or if it's in Africa, that you can almost predict what's gonna happen.
Yeah, man. And just real quick, it's tied to the intellectual genealogy of world power, how that even operates and how they even view it, right? I'm reading a book right now called White World Order, Black Power Politic. And in the book, the original Foreign Affairs magazine that we know of now, at first it was known as a Journal of Race Development. W.E.B. Du Bois even wrote in it. And the foundation of the idea was these people in these subtropical regions are uncivilized, or they're incapable of civilization, and these other groups might be civilized.
And if you're uncivilized, you're incapable of self-rule.
I mean, that's why America still holds Guam. That was a whole argument for Guam not becoming an independent state and Puerto Rico not becoming an independent state. And another argument at the time, Mexico not becoming part of what is the United States, is because they didn't want to have that mongrel blood mix with. See, there's a constant theme of that this is the foundation. And instead of looking at it and addressing and rethinking that foundation, they have just switched up the words. And even now, you even hear words like you just read. Well, they're like civilized. They're like us. You would be surprised, right? And the same thing happened in Bosnia during, Clinton administration, when we intervened there. And like these type of things are a constant theme, right? There's not a coincidence that we are more willing to drop nuclear bombs on Japan, but we would never do that to Germany, right? We would never do that in the middle of Europe. And it just speaks to what the value of life is, and it's tied to race. And I wish it wasn't so. I wish I could just ignore it and it would just go away. But that extension to what it is today is directly what we see. And so, like, even when we talk about the continent of Africa and the countries and the conflicts that are involved right now in Congo and Sudan and all the places, people are like, oh, my Lord, like they're killing each other. Number one, you got to realize those borders were artificially created by European powers at the Berlin Conference in 1885. And those artificial borders didn't pay attention to historic ethnic differences between groups and even place them together. And then European powers took what they learned with the natives here in America and other places, and then placed folks against each other. And you can see the same thing in India, in the Indian subcontinent, with those different countries that have developed there, in the middle of what is now Western Asia, with the British Mandate. All these type of things were created at that point where they looked at folks, majority of the world's population, as beneath them, and that somehow that they had to decide for the betterment of their civilization. And that you can literally point and draw a line to those conflicts, just like we can point a line and draw to where gun violence is consolidated in our cities based on redlining. It's like directly connected. And instead of dealing with the root of the issue, instead of being honest about what it means to deal with the root of the issue, folks double down and be like, well, something's wrong with those people. This is what happens when these savages are put together. And this language is still used to this day.
Wow. So that's gotten so deep. Yeah. So human geography will lead you to ask questions about how people moved, how they got to where they are, migration patterns, but
their
then just, so, and we know in some cultures, African and Native American, there is no such thing as conversations about justice that don't start with conversations about land, right? Like, so, so much of what you all just said, Africa is the most resource-rich country in the world when it comes to rubber and cocoa and diamonds and cobalt. And I keep going down the list. They're the world's biggest provider of everything. So why do we think of Africa as poor? Why do we have school children in the United States that when you talk about Africa, the first thing that comes in their mind are huts and people, or Donald Trump's language of shithole countries, right? If they're so shithole, let me just, Mr. Europe, if they're so shithole, why y'all going to them to get everything that you need to live? Right? Well, tell me, I mean, is there cocoa and rubber in Sweden? Aren't there some diamonds in Denmark? I mean, why y'all got to get on a bus all the time and go somewhere? Why are you flying everywhere to get everything you need? The story that killed me at one point, and I've said it on this show, I think, Sharif, you and I talking before, was just like, at some point it clicked to me that France is terrible. France is like probably one of the worst colonial powers still alive to this day that doesn't get the rep that they deserve. They are a horrible, horrible people. And I say this as a Creole. So I just want to be real clear about this. They are a terrible people. But the story that I heard, not just with them making African countries still use their currency, even though they have moved on to the American dollar, they force their formerly colonized countries to still use the franc or whatever it is, the French devalued currency. But they have a country, and I can't remember which one it was, so somebody gut checked me at some point about this, that they made them tear down all their crops and start growing peanuts so that they could make peanut butter for France. And because they turned over all their crops and started growing peanuts, they can't feed themselves because they can't grow the diversity of crops that they used to grow, because now they're basically just an ancillary colony to France for what France needs in terms of agricultural products. So I don't know that it's just peanuts, but it's a simple number of things that France needs them to grow. So the whole country has become just basically an exporter for France. And now they can't feed themselves. They're considered to be poor, like many African countries. I think we need to find a way to challenge young people, that picture that they see in their head of a poor Africa, to kind of shock them with the confrontation of, well, you know why that is, don't you? Mm-hmm. Or you know that they're really not poor. You know that when you see people walk around with all these diamonds when they get married or whatnot, you want to know where those come from, right? Mm-hmm. How can they be so poor?
Yeah. I mean, I remember one of the, as a social studies teacher, one of the exercise, I had 8th graders. So I just wanted them to just be able to think, right? Again, I always talk about like whose story is centered, whose story is missing, that kind of thing. But I remember one of the exercises we used to do was, kind of drawing this picture, this imagination of, you have all this gold in your basement, right? All this gold in your basement, like tons of it. You can't even use it all. Yet, if upstairs you have very little food, no windows, no electricity, and there's someone that has access to the gold. Like, so I would just want them to like kind of bring it home and just think about how could this happen? What would this mean? You know what I mean? So all the questions that I would want them to ask about a colonized state, apply that to just something that they could go home and think about, right? Like, because sometimes it's so abstract and it's like so far away, and they're just like, well, they should just do it. They should just, it's always like, oh, they should just, we see similar reactions here about what should have happened during enslavement, when every policy, every border, you can't read, everything is stacked up against you, right? I just wanted them to be able to understand, and then also start introducing them to some of the same folks I was introduced to. These people were in our calendar, our school calendar, right? Like, so these were people we were talking about, Sankara and Sekou and Nkrumah, and right, like, and King Jaja, like all these folks are folks that we're constantly learning about. I was like, all right, how can I share this with them, as well? So like, all right, yeah, we're leaving the land, but we're going to leave a puppet. We're leaving the land, but we're going to own the land that we're left, like all these kind of things are helping them to just try to wrap their brains around as, 14, 15-year-olds, and the older they get, the more understanding that they have, the deeper you can go. But some of the basic concepts of justice, fairness, oppression, they're well equipped to be able to analyze.
That all sounds like woke stuff. Y'all sound
most
woke
definitely,
now.
Most definitely. I miss it.
You need to stop that wokeness. Go ahead, Ish. What were you gonna say?
Oh no, I was just about to say, and that's even tied to how you start saying, well, what is the ultimate goal then, right? Because even when I used to kind of like do the whole thing where we go over the mythology or how Africa's portrayed in the Western media, right, as a reflection of the Western media's conception of what Africa is. But actually on the ground, you show them like these cities, and I've seen this done before, but then I would smack them over the head and be like, well, is that the goal? Is the goal just to replicate structures that created the situation to begin with, right? And then you start to get into really wokeness, right? When you really start to go down the rabbit hole of like, okay, so when we tell these countries you can become like us, right? Or like the United States or like Europe by doing these things, right? And then we have these politicians who benefit from it. They go to colleges at like Oxford and Cambridge and come back to their country. Ultimately, though, what is the goal, right? Is the goal just to simply have an exploitative system there that benefits the other, like a pyramid scheme benefits your benefactor? Or is it something else? And those, I think, are the questions that folks need to really start grappling with, because right now we're at a point where it's unsustainable. We see the fruits of what has, or the rotten fruits of what it has produced, right? The environment is going down the hole. We have a situation where conflicts are just everywhere and rumors of war everywhere. And I think that is directly tied to kind of the structures and systems that have been put in place and set in motion over the last 400, 500 years. From the first European who was like, oh, I have gold. Let me take your woman and bring her back and make her my concubine, and then have children, and those children are my bastards, and then I'll treat always as not as part of it, right? And then you just compound that for 400, 500 years, and you look around and you wonder why the situation looks like it is today. And then we don't challenge our students to imagine something different. We tell them to put on the suit, co-sign, get a good job, and become part of it. And I would argue, right, and I know that's a really radical idea, y'all, I would argue that we're doing a disservice to the future generations if we don't start trying to think of something different than what currently exists.
I mean, how's that take place, though, when you're talking about people that have such a head start? They own much of the world. I'm seeing in my mind that we're slipping the other direction, right? And to your point, we need big ideas. We need to think of ways to advance ourselves, but it's seeming like the door is closing. It feels like the window is closing, especially like there's so many things in our way in all these places. Let me see the best way that I could describe what I'm trying to say. Like Fiji and places like the islands, when you introduce outside ways of life to them, they start having an obesity problem, and they start having things they never had before, like heart trouble and illnesses that they didn't have before. And part of that is because the act of being colonized is to be satiated in some way with a whole bunch of artificial things that aren't good for you, fillers. So in America, it's consumerism, right? So like if you told people we need to start sacrificing because we want to do something very different, we want a success as a people, they'd be like,
good luck.
I want an iPhone. I want an iPhone. Yeah, I want a Benz and a Bentley and all that. In Fiji, it's the food imports. They're replacing their diet with a commercial Western diet that's killing everybody, across the world or whatever. And at that point, when you start trying to save people and they're already obese, they're already like full of kind of artifacts in their bodies and in their minds and in their spirits, it's kind of hard to say, now you're going to turn that around. I think they got you. Slavery just changed its chains. The chains just changed. The ones that we have now are invisible. And there's really good benefits to slavery now. Like American slaves are super well taken care of by world standards. So how are you going to get people to see that they need something different?
I ain't oppressed.
Give up their iPhone.
I ain't oppressed.
Because it's got cobalt in it, right? Like your phone that that I'm relying, I should say that I'm relying upon every day, actually it has slavery in it. My phone has slavery in it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My phone is a slavery instrument.
So does the chocolate we eat. The Supreme Court ruled that they don't have jurisdiction in other places. So those children who pick cocoa leaves as almost as slave labor in other countries. Oh, America's like, even if it's a U.S. company, we don't have jurisdiction over it. So they're allowed to continue that. And my whole thing is like, we, again, just need to be honest. Like, I can tell you right now, we're not going to turn the ship. We're not, right? Mm-hmm, but it doesn't mean we can't plant those seeds that might grow into a tree that creates shade that we'll never sit under, right? But our children's children might sit under. And we have to be preparing our students for that. We have to ask them to think about that and be critical about that and demand justice and transformation in the world. And too often, I feel like that's scary to folks. Because quite frankly, it is scary to folks. But I would say not doing anything is even more scary because we see what's happening. And I don't want to say it's too late. I still have hope, even though I'm a very pessimistic person. I still have hope in folks waking up and be like, yo, like something isn't right here. Something's not right in the spirit. Something's not right in the mind, right? And then start the process of changing that. I don't know from there.
Yeah, I mean, like, we said something earlier about World War III, and I'm looking at this headline. Trump warns Iowans of World War III and immigrants destroying our blood. Now, if you want to think that this is where we are in 2024 now, I'm sorry, that you have a person who's running for the top office in the country, who already has held it and is the biggest criminal of anybody. Like, there have been lots of criminals that have run for president. I'm going to argue that he's the most obvious criminal that there's ever been. And by obvious, I mean, he doesn't even hide his crime, right? He just be like, I'm under indictment. I'm going to run for president, right? Like talk about the privilege of that, I'm about to go to jail.
Well, the judge tried to hold him in contempt and he was just like yelling at the judge or whatever. Anybody else would have been like locked up for.
It's like, what do you mean? So you don't hold me in contempt? I was just
like,
You can't hold a person in contempt who is contemptible, right? Yeah, who is contempt. He's the embodiment of contempt. But this idea of, doom, we're facing World War III. It's the destroying of the blood. There's a congressman who said you can't build a civilization with someone else's baby. He was meaning immigration, right at that point. Right. We're talking about immigrants as not people, not as human beings. We're talking about them as invaders. They're invading our borders and they're doing.
You invade the land that we took from you. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
right. Well, how do you put Ukrainians on a plane to come here and have them show up in the suburbs of Chicago and other places just fine and land just fine and blend right in? But when it comes to others, they're destroying our blood. They're rapists. They're not sending us their best. They're destroying our borders. They're destroying our country.
One's brown,
and then you have governors.
Not.
Exactly. Right. But that's that now see, you got to see race and everything, Sharif. That's just terrible. See how you always do that? You make everything about race.
Why is everything about race? Just
everything got to be about race. Ish, to that last point, though, and I know you wanted to talk about a different type of geography than human geography that is related. They all relate to each other. But this idea that the borders, the structures, the things that exist that came before us could be disturbed or changed or moved feels like an overwhelming idea. It just doesn't feel like that's even possible in some ways because the game is so good.
Yeah. I don't know how to address that. I know that when it comes to human geography, you can go into what's known as critical geographies, and that's different ways of looking at space and power. So even when we talk about gentrification, when we talk about displacement, when we talk about environmental racism, like why are certain things built in certain neighborhoods and then why are cancer rates so high? You start to look critically at the foundation. Again, like it's very much tied to race in a society that doesn't even want to really truly be honest about its own history around race. It's like you can't even get to the foundation of really what informs all these type of ideas and concepts. I was reading a essay article by Wade Nobles that our homie Sharif Akusa gave me the other day. And it was talking about how the foundation of educational psychology was rooted by a white supremacist. And that all his students from John Dewey and everybody that we lay at the foundation of how children are taught is rooted in racism. And like the top guy was even saying, oh, well, those people aren't capable of thinking or learning or being part. We need to teach them how to get jobs or, be manual laborers for this or whatever. And the same view is then exported it around the world. So, but like critical geographies looks at kind of more of the contemporary manifestation in our current situation in America, what it is, right? So like when we look at, Flint, Michigan, is that water still dirty over there? Mm-hmm. I don't even know. They haven't covered that in the media in a minute, but I know it was last year. And so like when it comes to this
kind of other cities that had worse water, they're like, hey, let's just stop talking about this.
Yeah, man. And our schools, and it becomes like a thing where folks are viewed as kind of like not as worthy to benefit from civilization or whatever that means, which is actually just based off the backs of people of color. And I would even, and just this final point, I know I'm talking way too much.
No, you're not.
No, you're good.
The only reason this society is not fascist, right? By default, right? Because let's not forget, this country was founded with slavery, right? The first 72 years of this country, 50 years of it had a slave owner in office. 50 years of that first 72. And I can tell you the two presidents that didn't. It was John Adams and then his son, John Adams. Those were the two, John Quincy Adams. Those were the two people, two presidents at that time. They didn't have slaves because they were in Massachusetts. Everybody else did, though. Mm-hmm. And so the only reason this country hasn't done that, has a semblance of humanity and humanness, has been what Black people have fought for, bled for, and also advocated for others to benefit from the modern, civil rights movement, right, to even questions of the reconstruction of citizenship, right? The 14th Amendment wouldn't exist if Black people weren't agitating for that. It wasn't just simply given. It was also folks in Congress pushing for that. Black folks in Congress pushing for it.
You're underestimating the benevolence of good white folks, though. So you need to.
He always does that. He always does that. Yeah,
we can't forget about John Adams. No, I'm playing.
Yeah,
but like this is the thing. They did it all. Like they gave it to us. But like that narrative, our folks believe. Our folks don't understand that. Like co-signing, I think it was the Black Power mixtape documentary, which is wonderful. If anybody's seen it,
you haven't seen that, check it out.
Check it out.
Must see TV.
The dude from The Last Poets in it, I don't know if y'all remember it, said one part, he's like, Black folks love America. We'll hold it to our bosom, our breast. Like we feed off America. We give America everything that we have. He's like, start being afraid when Black folks lose their mind. Then this whole thing's down the chute. And of course, I'm paraphrasing, but even this concept of what it is even to be American, it goes back to something I keep on referring to. Are you talking about the America of George Washington or America of Harriet Tubman, right? Are you talking about folks who fought, bled, and fought for everybody's rights like King? Or are you talking about folks who want to just consolidate and have more and act like a king and control and be a domination over others? Which America are you talking about?
Yeah.
And as soon as we lose that freedom one, which I feel slipping away, right? Well, I just read an article this morning about a 16-year-old boy who shot a 17-year-old boy on the subway platform at 9:30 under City Hall in Philadelphia last night. When we talk about that reality, what is happening? And then I would even argue that that's a reflection of too many folks co-signing what they actually think America is and actually truly becoming an American in the George Washington sense and not in the Harriet Tubman sense.
Yeah, that reminds me. I used to love like just having these quotes and having kids analyze. One of them was Langston Hughes, and it was Negroes. Reminds me of like what you just quoted, Last Poets, but Negroes sweet and docile, meek, humble, and kind. Beware the day that they change their mind. And then just having like, so what does that mean? Like, you know what I mean? Which then is connected to Dr. King when he's talking about like, what riots mean and, the voices of the unheard and things like that, right? Like, so how does all this connect? But then also always showing like, how have we survived this? How have we still inserted revolutionary joy and love within the space, but not, and I would like really critique, because how do you make sure we have love and joy without being 100% distracted and turning the joy into buffoonery and clownish, behavior, entertainment rather than joy? Because to me, it's always been a difference. between like, joy and then just entertaining for entertaining sense, which is a slippery slope to buffoonery and clown. And we, unfortunately, we're bombarded with that. Our kids are bombarded with that stuff as well, which allows, which causes, you see a lot of the revolutionary, we're losing so many of them, right? Like Baba Sekou Denga, and many others, like he's ill. And we just see like this passing on, and how many of them are like, yo, we sacrificed a lot for this to be happening, right? But many of them haven't become totally pessimistic, but they definitely feel disappointed in many ways that we have not taken the baton further. And, and again, we might not see the total change, but at least amplification and making sure like, no, this is a problem, making sure people are aware of it.
So some deep reflections I have just listening to the two of you all, or both of you all. I don't know if you've read Iceberg Slim, but one of the interesting things about Iceberg Slim writing, and for those that don't know, Iceberg Slim is one of the people that I think was the most interesting thing about the psychology of
that you voted.
I mean, it's deep because it's the psychology of a pimp, and it teaches you pimpology, pimp science, right? It's not just about like thinking that pimps are people without a science to what they do. There's a method for recruiting, for transferring people from having agency to not having agency, to when you ask questions of why do they stay so long, there's a reason, like there's a science to it. So for people who think it's just there's a few things that are really important. It's a mind trick. It's a science to it. The fear that you always have is that they're going to rebel or leave or take your money or whatever. So the answer to that is violence, and that they always know that violence is possible so that they stay in line. And if you think about the relationship of the United States with people of color, it is exactly the things I just said. It's a mind trick. They implant things into your mind. But the ultimate kind of thing that keeps you in line is that you know that violence is possible. Violence is not just possible, it's probable. Like you will get a slap, you will get hurt, so in some cases, some of our best leaders and best minds have been killed. You've been assassinated.
Some of that violence is consistent, right? And then there's a possibility of greater violence, right?
Right. But the thing that precedes the violence and the need to control every part of you, including your thinking, is the fear that slave masters had about slave riots, slave revolts, being killed in the middle of the night, Nat Turner. That's the stuff that creates the violence in your mind, because you know you're doing something to a people where you need to keep them being slaves and keep them being like docile. The idea that they might riot or tear down something or blow up something or just become aware one day to the point where they lose their minds is the fear that makes you systematize your violence. Right. It makes you create kind of like systems to keep yourself safe. So like Iceberg Slim, you could keep having people work for you and not know that they're working for you and fear leaving the work that they do for you. It's a pimp game, right? We are being pimped by the United States of America. Now, see, people listen to this or whatnot. I know I sound crazy, but listen, there is a science, there's a way. Here's where that came from. Ish, as you were talking and you said critical geography, I looked up critical geography, and here's for people listening, the quick reference on that is the umbrella term for a group of geological concepts and procedures that are centered on opposition to repressive and inequitable power relations in capitalism, class, colonialism, disability, ethnicity, gender, race, and sexuality. So when you say critical, you put critical beneath anything. That's your first indication that oppressed people are starting to lose their minds. They're starting to investigate. They're starting to criticize and be critical about their situation. That whole thing James Baldwin said about the paradox of education is that the more you become educated, the more you're like ready to overturn education and everything else, like everything you've been taught, right? So that's why critical has become a bad word. Critical race theory, critical theories, critical whatever. Oh, that's Marxist. That's terrible. We got to outlaw. We got to stop kids from learning it. We got to stop kids from it, because they don't want you to have the tools to investigate the thing that will eventually make you lose your mind.
Yeah, don't think
the thing that eventually will turn you into Nat Turner.
Don't think critically. Think about what we tell you to think about, but don't think critically about.
Think uncritical, and that's Iceberg Slim all the way. You don't think. You just bring me my money.
Listen,
You
I mean,
don't think?
and again, things that we have to expose students and adults to, because again, people don't realize this, but even the fact that, I used to just let them sit with this idea, just think about this. Like, Thomas Jefferson, was quoted as saying, like, if there is a God, there's gonna be hell to pay for what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, like, this is their lauded hero. And he's saying, if there is a God, we're going to hell, based off of just how we're yet staunchly defending what he said will be condemned to hell for. Like, I mean, that is like just even, from a philosophical standpoint, from a practical standpoint, like just all of it, just being able to sit and think about what does that mean? And someone who goes through the depths of not only policy, but also policy in DC and policy on his plantation, what he still fought vehemently for is like, I mean, yeah.
I'll say this as we get closer to the end here, and I'll let both of you brothers push back on this. But this is knowledge. This is education. This is something that I wonder how you transfer what we just said to a mass group of people, especially young people, in a format and in a way that they will understand, and that it will break through, that it will pierce the bubble, because many of them have a bubble, an American bubble that we're living in. And what you're trying to do is pierce it, like disturb the way that they're seeing the world. And it's not easy, because we have things called entertainment. We've got a whole bunch of surfacey stuff that people we got social media. We got all kinds of other stuff that you're fighting against, which seems impossible to fight against. Now, this is the part where I say, okay, push back on me. Because one of the number one communication vehicles ever invented in the United States and in the world, specifically by Black folks, is music and hip hop, right? And for a period of time, I've made this critique before, and we'll make it again. We owned it for a period of time. It was ours. We owned the drum beats, right? And in some weird place or way, whatever, it got gentrified, colonized, and actually taken over. And now we work for the people that are actually the largest distributors of the thing that we invented and our communications vehicle. And what I've said to y'all before is, where's the conscious hip hop? All this Lil Pumps and Lil this and Lil that and babies this and babies that and whatever and whatever.
Right.
Yeah. And Ish pushed me on it before. He's like, well, Talib Kweli and
Prez is going really
Prez or whatever. Yeah, first of all, people that nobody listens to no more except for us. But here's the parallel that I will draw. Mos Def, right, is not Mos Def anymore, right? Who is he now?
Yasin Bey.
Yasin Bey. Where does he live?
South Africa.
Why?
Because he got out of this place.
Because he lost his mind. Because he did
what
Du Bois did. He did what David Chappelle did, except for David Chappelle lost his mind, found himself in Africa, and then came back and was more crazy. But for the rest of these brothers, they eventually come to a point where they feel like America's not winnable. They feel like the more enlightened you become, the more you realize at some point, actually, the devil got you. This is not a winnable maze that you're in. You keep thinking that liberation is just around the corner. And, the boys eventually gave up. I don't know if that's the right terminology to say he gave up. He eventually found his consciousness somewhere else, right? And decided to just like that the battle here was not going to be won. Yeah. Yasin Bey actually lives in another country right now, because the more he saw the consumerism in hip hop, the more he saw the rules, the contracts, how things work, what people want you to say, what you can't say, how controlled you are and all that. Eventually he lost his mind and said, I don't need to make this money.
Kwame Ture, he came back though, right? But he moved too, right? Like, because significant number of folks. I don't know. I mean, this is also, it just makes me think of, and I always butcher it, but Chris, you probably have it memorized by heart, what Dr. Fuller used to say about it's not winnable. Who is he quoting?
I think he may have been quoting John Hope Franklin. Okay. I'm not sure. But I think, the quote that he says oftentimes is that when people were in slavery, that they knew that they had no chance of winning. They knew that they had no chance of escape. So the only thing that they could do to stay alive was extend the lines of hope. So they were living purely on the resistance of still hoping, even knowing that there's no chance of winning and you can't escape. They got us here. We can't escape. There's no boat we can jump on. There's no swimming that we can do. And and in terms of victory and beating it, they've got us outnumbered. They've got bigger guns. They have a bigger system. And as of today, Black folks, for instance, are 13% of the population, and they've remained 13% of the population, even though we have more love music than anybody else, and we seem to be loving a lot more than everybody else. Somehow, mysteriously, we have stayed at 13% of the population, and actually might be going down to 12, 11, 10% as we look at projections toward the future, which is why we're being pushed aside as the major minority. Actually, now that status is a legacy status. We are like the legacy. We are the emeritus of minorities now, right? Like, you got to think about that, right? I see you. I see that look on your face. What's wrong with y'all? What's wrong with what I said?
Black population actually grew last year and the year before, so it's been growing regardless of how many. See, like, that's a testament, though. No matter how much times they try to kill folks, even in the 1800s, these scientists walking around talking about, oh, well, Black people will just disappear over time. Benjamin Rush walked around with an albino. He was a doctor, walked around with an albino and was like, look, when Black people get civilized, they turn white. And this was the idea. Like, they thought like that is, you never heard that?
Wow.
That is yeah. And you know, it was in the Ibram Kendi and Stand From Beginning, and I don't agree with that man's conclusions whatsoever. He on some other stuff with the conclusions, but that history of the fact that we even have a school named after him in Philadelphia. And he's held up as some type of abolitionist. But if you actually look at his argument's like, well, they'll become civilized and then turn white, or that Black people would die out. Like, that was a belief at one time by scientists and folks in America. And then Black people still remain 13%. Black people were 13% in 1899. So, like, no matter what they do, how many they kill, the Black people are so resilient within this society that, like, we're even growing right now in population numbers. And that I'm hoping a lot of our brothers who are coming through the borders right now, that their children learn to be Black and pick up this legacy also. And what that means. You know what
they're going to choose on that census, bro. Stop it. Stop it.
I know. Can I pray, man? Can I pray?
You're like, be a Black Brazilian, but like, yo, I'm white. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at, I'm looking at it here from 2000, the Black percentage went from 12.1 to 12.5%. And that's the total U.S. population. When it comes to age under 16, the number of us that are under 16 and African Americans, people don't know this. African Americans are younger than everybody else. They're younger than white people, meaning that we usually have a bigger supply of young people and we don't live as long. So we're a younger population than white folks. So under 16, between that same time period, we went from 14.6 to 13.7. So number of younger people are starting to decline, which is a prediction for the future. And at the same time, Latino and Hispanic went from 12.6 to 18.5 of the total population. And they went from 17% to 25% of the under 16 population. This is my thing about we're a legacy status minority at this point. Also growth in people of two or more races, Asian Americans. The only group that seems to always fare about the same or worse than us is the Native American population. And they are the population when it comes to human geography that could give us a really good lesson in the United States about land power, how people are moved around, migration patterns. I mean, the Trail of Tears and all that stuff where you just pick up and you make people walk, long distances until their feet bleed.
And then give them blankets full of smallpox to make sure that you max. You didn't know that either?
No, I did. And I'm like, bruh, like, what type of evil mind does it take to say, I mean, Sharif, I think I heard you say kill all the buffalo at one point. This is the iceberg slim thing. It was a science. Yeah. It wasn't just being mean to people. You had to think about things like if we kill all the buffalo and we know that they live off of buffalo, if we move them around in land, they'll automatically die because they're so spiritually connected to where they live or whatnot. If we march them hundreds of miles somewhere else or whatnot, half of them will die and won't make it because they'll just be so dispirited.
Don't forget, these aren't just like crazy rednecks off the thing. These are government policy who also recruit the crazy rednecks to help them implement their policy, right? Like, so it's not just like, oh, this, fringe group. Oh, that January 6th fringe group. Like, no, that January 6th is a continuation of things, of lynch mobs that were supported by sheriff departments, protected by judges and government, right? Like, this is a continuing legacy.
Yeah, and they're not seen as like, I heard, who was it? it was someone, Elise Stefanik, who's the one who did the big, anti-Semitic grandstanding in a congressional hearing. She said she called them the January 6th hostages.
So did Trump.
Right. So let me get this right. You spent a couple of years dissing Black folks for finally losing their minds and burning down cities, supposedly, which, there's a whole nother story there. But you stormed the whole Capitol, broke windows, threatened the vice president of the United States in the process.
With a noose hanging, right? Like with a noose hanging, not just like verbal. Like this is
there
wild,
an
man.
Intelligent person who believes if that was Black and brown people doing that,
Jamel
that we'd be having a whole different
if
conversation?
we even had a thought bubble of doing that, we'd have got slaughtered. She said, "Forget doing it. If you had even thought to fix your lips to speak about something like that, you would have been raided."
Yeah.
And so it's just a continue. We often talk about the Trail of Tears, but like that, the Bear River one was even worse, right? Like, what I mean? Or a Wounded Knee. We think about Wounded Knee a lot, but the Bear River one, that was over 300 people, and we, the one thing that's annoying about being alive in this time is like the same people use the same terms, like unapologetic and authentically yourself. Like I cringe every time. I hate unapologetic. I hate certain terms that just everyone.
That's so negative.
Yeah, I
just
hate it, man. But I'm like, who the originally unapologetic folks were? Well, rabid racists. They were the actually unapologetic about, because they're like, I don't care if you're a child. And worse, I don't care if you're my child. I could have sired you and I'm going to still kill you. I could have sired you and I'm going to still sell you to the Caribbean. Like, I mean, the depravity of it all is like, and the language has changed, but mindsets matter most.
Yeah. And it makes me think of a James Cone quote. You can be like, you can change the language. The oppressor can change their language, but not the social political positioning of the victim, right? And so you can switch up the way you're talking about it, but the reality remains the same. And that goes back to the continuity of this, right? When we're talking about anti-immigrant sentiments within this country, that's American as apple pie, man. They've been anti-immigrant from jump. The first law that these people passed in 1790 after the Constitution was the Naturalization Act that says if you're white, you can become a citizen only if you're a white man, you know what I mean? And it literally was codified in law. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1924 Immigration Act, you can just go down the pipe and it's just constantly always at the exclusion of non-whites within this country. And then even speaking at that very purposely and so they'll switch up the language, right? But it still remains the same. So Sharif, you made a great point, and I was thinking the same thing. We always talk about Black rage, right? Why don't we ever talk about white rage in this country? White rage is a real thing, and it has devastated.
That's the actual thing that has shaped the country, the psyche. Like, that has consistently, but it's always talking about Black people, they broke the windows at Kmart. I don't care. What I mean? It's immaterial compared to historically and and for everyone who constantly talks about that was in the past, just a couple years ago, what happened and what's the fallout, from that's continued.
I think that the rage, if you were to do some discourse about the white rage and put that as a front and center, make that a class, for instance, that actually is a pit stop on the way to white fear. And white fear is a pit stop on the way to talk about people having an unearned status, advantaged position in economics and global superiority that they don't want to lose. And the fear is that if you did lose that, let's say we had some egalitarian overturning of that or whatnot, the fear is once they become the subjects, once they don't hold the stick anymore over everybody else, if it was possible for others to have the nukes and to have everything too, that they might become what they don't want to become, which is us, right? Like that. Can you imagine the idea? The psychology is different than us because what we want to do is move from not being free to being free. That's a much more hopeful and aspirational. Hopeful and aspirational. Right. But imagine being saying somebody wants to take away your house, your money, your power, everything that you have. That's a different transition. I would fear that more than I fear becoming free. So the people who are freedom fighters of the world are actually pursuing something that doesn't create fear, it creates hope. The people who want to keep them from achieving what they have, I mean, because the biggest fear I think white Americans have is that when when America is fully browned, once they are no longer the majority, that they will be subjects rather than the people who are making people subjects.
Yeah, but I always like question it though. Like I hear that a lot, and like, oh, they're afraid that their population is dwindling, they're not having kids, blah blah blah, like all of that. And at the same time, I'm like, well, we grew up, like our generation, we watched apartheid South Africa be
it was COINTELPRO,
a minority in Botswana, Uganda, like these other places. Like it's not unheard of for, particularly the position of power. So you can have the population and still not have the power, right? Like, and so I think it's just, I just caution people not to just be too celebratory. Like, hey, 2060, we're going to outnumber them, and they are like, I'm like the ones who are like behind the wall, behind the veneers, I don't think they care. Like, who's it?
No, and this is where, so I'm agreeing with you in that just because the populations change doesn't mean that you all of a sudden have the power, right? Like you could just look at places like South Africa and other, realize that a minority can oppress a majority population.
And if we rely on voting,
if
we rely on voting solely, which a lot of people are in love with, like that.
Here's where I'll push back though. Here's where I'll push back though. In all of those places where the white establishment was about to lose its numbers or its powers in some way, shape, or form, it created a political desperation to create systems that push back on the loss. And in the United States right now, we're starting to see late stage white supremacy start to act out. Mm-hmm. That's where all this stuff is. That's where Trump is coming from. That's where this fear that things, that's where all that's coming from.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So late stage white supremacy will start transitioning you into a different type of power system that becomes more brutal. And that's where we are right now.
But then one thing is, but then the fear is that when they see that it's inevitable, what's the veneer that they put in place as they
Neocolonialism.
Exactly.
Say it with me, people. Neocolonialism.
Right? You know what I'm saying? It's like,
you're right.
All right, we concede here's this, right? Like, and then, like that's also, we just got to, again, back to history and got to learn, like in a different context, but still, they don't, even with we're always talking about like the new context, the new situation we're in, their playbook remains the same.
That's true.
The divide and conquer, the false veneer, putting someone like, oh, this looks like you, or, the parading of someone to counter. All of that is the exact same for hundreds and hundreds of years, even with the new context. So we just got to be aware.
When we talk about human geography, how people move around or whatnot, and what you just said, the playbook stays the same. Here's one thing in the playbook that I beat up on all the time because I've seen it in writing so much. Mm-hmm. Every time white numbers start dwindling, they find a probationary population to become the new whites.
Yes. Yep.
So there were white people that weren't white for a period of time. Mm-hmm. And every time they needed to beef up the white population, they went to the Italians and said, y'all kind of dark. You kind of dark, but we can make you white, right? And the Italians were like, for real? Damn, really? And then they went to the Irish and they were like, y'all ain't never been nothing. We hate you. You are the white black people, but you're going to be white now. And the Irish were like, for real? Okay. All right. Well, they brought them in. They became white and it just kept going. And now they're doing it with Asians and Hispanics and to some degree with blacks. This is the iceberg slim thing. One of the ways you can save yourself is to actually join the program and become Candace Owens and become Thomas Sowell and become Clarence Thomas. That's a job. And it's a good job. I might actually take it. Actually, to be very honest with y'all, y'all might look up at some point and I might be like, listen, I'm sorry, y'all.
I mean, and it's not, and we often talk about the Latino, the previous white, how they became white and the Latino, but also, like these folks from, even though they're usually banned from entering, Arabs, Iranians, you know what I mean? Like even though many of them
They're classified
They're
as white.
classified as white, even though if you ask them, they don't consider themselves white. Not in their, I'm not again, not all. Some of them absolutely. They're like, yeah, what was the German thing he was trying to do? The Aryans. So like some of them, like, no, we're of Aryan descendants, but many of them they don't consider themselves white. But in this country, if you're here, you are white. You know what I mean?
Well, I just saw something yesterday that was saying that Nikki Haley checked white on her voter slips or whatnot, and then they showed a picture of her family, and they were like, "This is a group that's calling itself white, and these people are very dark."
Well, that was also on Halloween, probably. You know what I mean? She probably says like this. That's how we dressed up for the American holiday. We're white.
So the last thing I'll say about my point about the playbook of getting new probationary whites to beef up the numbers as they start losing is that one of the conditions of accepting that status is actually being anti-black. Yep. Anti-blackness is a condition of joining the team.
And the sooner you get a black belt and being anti-black, the sooner you get that stamp.
Bro, Candace Owens for me is the greatest example of exactly what I'm talking about, that racism is fair. It's a fair system. We all can join if we want to. It's actually like a fair system for everybody because it's actually it does have racial quotas. And like I look at her and she went from being a college dropout that was broke and had nothing to being a person who has a $50 million contract. And if you watch her content, she has gotten more and more anti-black every day. Like there's a point at which you have to start saying things that are crazier than the stuff you used to say. Like, well, I disagree with black people and such. And now you're like down to like, I think black people should die. It's just like, when you get her talking about police brutality and any of that stuff, and her point will be they deserve it. Yeah. And by they, she means her own people. Yeah.
Right. And the trajectory of where she was in high school. And wasn't that like, isn't she the one that actually...
She sued for discrimination in high school.
Discrimination,
Yeah, in high school with the NAACP. And there was no money in that. That was $30,000 she got in the settlement. She got $50 million to actually start telling America that black people are wrong about everything.
So I mean, anti-racist versus anti-black, like one of them pays out, more than the other.
I might have a new job. Y'all ever see me in a really nice car? I got a new job coming up. Just so you know,
anti-racist stuff. Like, sign me up for the anti-blackness.
Listen,
I'm in.
There is no retirement plan for justice. Right. There's no pension in that. You need to get with the program. All right, folks. Well, I know we're at the end of our time here. I just want to give you all the last word. This is, first of all, very enlightening for me, and I'm going to keep thinking about it. I did give my kid a hard time about like taking human geography, and then had to figure out what that was last night in the in the conversation with them. And you all have helped me see more of what it is. I'm wondering if I make too much of it to say this should be like one of the main topics that we push for our young people. Areas of study, I shouldn't call it a topic. This should be one of the main areas of study that we push for our kids. So I'll turn it over to you all for the last word on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, even if it's a course, because, it's still College Board, is all the complications with that. But I would say that type of thinking, anything that allows and pushes and elevates critical thinking and critical analysis of why we're here, how it happened, what are the relationships between human beings and human beings and the land? Any of that I think is just a great thing. For us, it was a easier entry point for students. We wanted them to, start thinking globally, as well as an entry to AP courses that we were, introducing. That was like, the first one is like statistics with AP math, right? Like AP statistics is a good entry point. So you start getting more complicated, more in depth, but also gives you this kind of background knowledge to draw from for other, to be able to just use in life. But I think, what, if you don't have AP human geography in your school, you can do it with a daggone newspaper. Like it doesn't have to be. It's really about what you as an educator, this leader of human beings, and you want them to think critically about where we are so that they can start thinking about what are solutions to the conditions that we find ourselves in. And how do we do it? How have people always done that? How do we continue to do that and applying the new old lessons, but in new context? So, the courses, I love the course. I loved it, which also means I love the teacher, Carlos Clay, who taught the class, was amazing. Shout out to Carlos Clay. He used to be our city year guy when I was at Shaw. When I went to Shoemaker, got him to come on board as the history teacher, and he implemented the course. So shout out to Carlos. Shout out to, it always comes back to dope teachers. Like, oh, whatever we talk about, you'll end up, do you have a dope teacher or not? That's the bottom line.
Mm.
Yeah, man. And I just want to say the Pimp and Hoe reference, I actually used that in class. Because what does the pimp do when the hoe gets out of line?
But I understand.
I'm going to send you a copy of this book.
Yeah,
I have it. Doom Fox.
Yeah.
Doom Fox.
Doom Fox, that's the name of the book?
That's one of his books.
Oh, yeah, this is a series. Oh, my gosh.
He's got lots of books, yeah.
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 So,
Ish, what's your final word, man?
I'm ignorant to that thing, except with Chris. He used to give us lectures all the time with 8 Black Hands about Iceberg Slip. You know, I thought it was a movie or something. So
they never made a movie. They have a
documentary, but yeah.
I might have to check that out. I didn't hear.
Yes. So final word, Ish, on human geography, applied geography, and what you introduced, critical geography.
Well, first, I got to say that, when it comes to geography, even basics, I was talking to my 12-year-old the other day. He's like, Dad, where's the Red Sea at? I'm like, oh, man, I'm slipping on the microphone. So like even basic kind of knowledge of those things, I think that we have to do a much better job, and also get away from like boxing these disciplines separate from one another.
Yes, that's the biggest problem. That's the biggest problem with American curricula is everything is siloed, everything is individualized. Like, that was another thing. We had our 7th graders take geography because I'm just like, y'all not going to keep talking about like just being unaware was like just too painful in my heart to not change that course.
Yep. And that speaks to kind of the Eurocentric imposition of worldview that too many folks are imprisoned to, right? And it doesn't allow us to think outside the box because the box becomes the measure in which we can succeed. And it's so important for our children to be exposed to these ideas that, I mean, if your child is under the age of 10 and has not heard of the Berlin Conference of 1885, if your child does not know about colonialism and what the definition of colonialism is before they leave elementary school, like these just basic tenets of understanding, so we can later on can build upon.
So we can actually have a class, and a conversation, right?
Yeah, so we ain't spending the whole class be like, this is where the Red Sea's at in freaking 11th and 12th grade, right? They need to know that when they enter the classroom, and then we can talk about, the Houthi rebels and Iranian influence in certain regions of the world compared to American influence, and where did that happen? What's the British mandate after the Ottoman Empire? Oh, wait, what's the Ottoman Empire? Where's that? So like, those rabbit holes can only be gone down once you actually have a basic understanding, and that basic understanding needs not to happen when you're 35 years old and be like, oh, wow, Africa's borders were split up by European countries? Oh, I never knew that before. Like, no, that should be just common sense knowledge.
Now you're depressing me all over again because you're talking about like 35-year-olds. I would say maybe 70% of Americans don't know what the hell you talking about. Those, just that last couple of sentences. They're like, what? Who? Where?
And that's what we need to break. And our children need to be put in a position, right? We need to be training teachers in classrooms. If you never heard about it, like I teach at UPenn's Urban Teacher Apprentices program, you best believe we go over these concepts. We go over the concept of precarious citizenship, how Black people have been internally forcibly migrated within the borders of the United States, how that's a reflection of how immigrants are treated, how that's a reflection of, and some of the things these people who are stepping in our classrooms never heard of before, but they're going to hear about it. And we got to be very purposeful to talk about it and not be afraid to make it about race, because quite frankly, it's about race. And
Chris,
that folks have ran around too much.
He about to be fired from that class.
All right. Well, listen, I appreciate you, brothers. As always, this is a communal learning opportunity for us every week, the ability to share a table and to talk about the things that help us critically reflect on what's the path behind us, but what's the path before us, right? Like you need to understand both. Need to understand the past, you need to understand today, and you need to like be thinking about how you make it better for tomorrow for our kids. And I think critical analysis is the way to get there. These type of conversations, I think, opens up everything. So for our people who are listening, you are family. Thank you so much for listening and watching Freedom Friday. It has been another Freedom Friday, and you are still not free. Let's be real about that. But hopefully you're freer than you were when we started this conversation today. Share the show, get other people involved. We appreciate you as always, and we'll see you on the next Freedom Friday.
Peace.